The first warning came from the outer system, where long-range sensors detected hundreds of warp signatures resolving into real space with synchronized precision, vectors converging on Sol from every viable approach. And within minutes the analysts confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. The Galactic Concordance had committed a full armada to Earth. Not a punitive expedition or limited strike force, but a civilization-level show of force designed to end the problem permanently. And as the tactical displays filled with red markers forming a tightening sphere around the planet, Admiral Helen Carter aboard United Earth Defense Command Station Atlas noted with quiet calm that the Concordance had followed the predicted approach corridors exactly, which meant they had dismissed every warning the simulations had ever shown. While across the system, civilian traffic rerouted automatically and defense protocols long kept from public view activated without announcement, orbital habitats sealed, underground shelters opened, and power grids shifted into hardened configurations as if the world had been waiting for this moment all along. Yet aboard the Concordance flagship Radiant Decree, High Marshal Vethrix of the Collian Dominion viewed the same encirclement with satisfaction, seeing only the culmination of years of frustration with humanity, a species that had refused protectorate status, resisted economic pressure, and withdrawn from galactic politics instead of submitting. Behavior the Concordance interpreted as fear and isolation rather than preparation, and now surrounded by warships from 12 allied species, Vethrix believed the illusion of human confidence would finally collapse, justifying the narrative that young species required firm correction. But when the formal demand for unconditional surrender were prepared, his communications officer reported that Earth had already responded, not with protest or panic, but with a brief acknowledgement stating the Armada was detected, identified, and in violation of existing accords, followed by a declaration that responsibility for what followed would rest entirely with Concordance Command. Language so flat and procedural it irritated Vethrix enough to dismiss it as posturing and order the ultimatum transmitted anyway, unaware that on Earth the message had already been broadcast globally, where President Miguel Alvarez addressed the population without theatrics or promises, reminding them that humanity had always planned for the day diplomacy failed, and that restraint should never be confused with helplessness. Words reinforced as data streams within military channels showed long-dormant assets activating throughout the system, industrial platforms shedding civilian identifiers to reveal armored hulls and concealed weapon arrays, research stations reconfiguring into command nodes, and deep space construct beyond Pluto executing commands embedded centuries earlier, while within the Concordance formation, the first anomalies appeared as picket probes vanished without energy spikes or debris, simply ceasing to exist. Sensor returns showing localized distortions that defied known physics. Reports Vethrix dismisses interference caused by fleet density as he ordered the encirclement tightened and final firing solutions prepared, convinced a decisive opening strike would shatter Earth's defenses, until a second human transmission arrived addressed directly to him through channels believed secure, containing only a single question asking why no human warship above a certain size had ever been observed outside Sol, a detail Vethrix had never considered relevant until alarms interrupted his response. Tactical officers shouting that unidentified contacts were appearing inside the formation without hyperspace signatures, an impossibility that became undeniable as massive shapes resolved on sensors, their mass readings eclipsing Concordance battleships, dark angular structures marked plainly in human script as system defense platforms, and in that instant understanding struck Vethrix with chilling clarity. The humans had never intended to fight on neutral ground or contest a galaxy ship for ship. They had engineered Sol itself into a weapon, and by surrounding Earth the Concordance Armada had placed itself precisely where humanity's hidden defenses were designed to activate, a realization that spread too slowly as the first human platform fired a sustained energy lance that cut through multiple cruisers as if shields were irrelevant, signaling to every commander present that the operation to intimidate Earth had instead triggered a trap laid generations in advance. Panic did not come all at once, but crept through the Concordance Armada in fragments as reports conflicted and sensor data refused to align with doctrine, because the first human strike had not been accompanied by fleet-wide broadcasts or declarations of war, but by silence broken only by the sudden absence of ships that had existed seconds earlier, and as damage assessments poured into the Radiant Decree. High Marshal Vethrix struggled to impose order on a battle space that no longer behaved as expected. Cruisers reporting shield collapse without overload warnings, carriers losing entire squadrons to weapons that left no debris fields, and command relays flickering as if space itself were interfering with signal coherence, forcing Concordance captains to fall back on local initiative, a dangerous necessity in a coalition fleet where doctrine varied wildly between species. While the human defense platforms continued to emerge in steady intervals, not jumping or accelerating in any recognizable fashion but unfolding from distortions that smoothed into normal space as if reality had been briefly folded and released, their positioning precise enough to suggest pre-plotted coordinates tied to the Armada's most likely formations, a fact that unsettled Vethrix deeply as it implied the humans had anticipated not just an attack but this exact deployment. And while Concordance gunners opened fire in overlapping salvos of plasma and coherent light, much of it passed harmlessly through projected void fields surrounding the platforms or dispersed against layered defenses that adapted faster than targeting solutions could update. Whereas a human return fire was deliberate and economical, lances targeting command vessels first, kinetic strikes impacting ships whose shields had already been subtly destabilized by earlier unseen effects, and as formations began to break apart under the strain. Vethrix ordered a coordinated push toward Earth itself, believing proximity to the planet would force humans to defend their atmosphere and population centers, a gamble rooted in the assumption that humans would prioritize civilian safety over tactical advantage. Yet the response was not what he expected, because Earth's orbital space did not bristle with frantic defensive fire but remained eerily calm as layers of Concordance ships crossed invisible thresholds and suddenly lost maneuverability. Drives stalling, inertial compensators failing, crews reporting crushing. Forces or zero gravity within seconds of each other, symptoms that baffled Concordance engineers but were instantly recognized by human command as gravity lattice activation zones, regions where artificial mass fields could be reshaped dynamically, turning space into a controlled environment hostile to anything not keyed to human transponders, and on Station Atlas Admiral Carter authorized the next phase without hesitation. Her voice steady as she acknowledged confirmations from Mars, Luna, and the Jovian Defense Ring, each reporting successful activation of their own sectors, while far below the population of Earth watched the sky through filtered feeds as distant flashes marked the destruction of ships that had once seemed invincible, the narrative shifting rapidly from fear to stunned realization that humanity was not merely resisting but dictating the engagement. And within the Concordance fleet, the psychological impact was devastating as species accustomed to overwhelming superiority confronted an enemy that refused to behave predictably or emotionally, offering no pleas, no threats, only action, and Vethrix found himself grappling not just with tactical failure, but with a collapse of the assumptions that had defined his career, that younger species lacked patience, that power had to be displayed to be effective, that deterrence relied on visibility. All beliefs undermined by the revelation that humanity's greatest strength had been its willingness to wait and build quietly. And as emergency council convened aboard surviving command ships, arguments erupted over retreat vectors, surrender protocols, and whether the Concordance Charter even allowed disengagement under such circumstances. Debates cut short when another wave of human constructs activated deeper within the formation, severing escape routes with fields that disrupted hyperspace initiation, leaving only narrow corridors that funneled fleeing ships directly past waiting defenses. And in that moment, Vethrix understood that the trap was not merely physical but political, because every loss, every recorded failure, would ripple outward through the galaxy, shattering the image of Concordance invincibility and forcing member worlds to question whether their leaders had provoked a power they could no longer control, a realization that settled heavily as he ordered a full withdrawal attempt despite the odds, knowing even if some ships escaped the truth would follow them, that Earth had not been besieged but had allowed itself to be surrounded so the galaxy could finally see what humanity had been capable of all along. The attempted withdrawal exposed the final depth of the miscalculation because the Concordance fleet had been built around the assumption that space was a neutral medium, something to be crossed or contested but never shaped, and as surviving ships burned for the narrow corridors their senses insisted were viable escape routes, they discovered too late that those paths existed only because humans wanted them to. Channels engineered to look like failures in containment where Concordance captains could convince themselves they still had agency, and as the first ships committed to those vectors, their drives spooled with familiar vibrations only to shudder violently as hyperspace apertures collapsed into turbulent shear, tearing hull plating away and scattering vessels into fragments that vanished without explosions, while others emerged partially translated. fuse into impossible geometries that left crews dead before they understood what had happened, events that spread through the Armada in raw, unfiltered distress calls until Concordance Command was forced to shut down open channels to preserve what little coordination remained. Yet even that decision failed to stop the unraveling because human forces did not pursue in the traditional sense. There were no chase formations or reckless advances. Instead, defense platforms repositioned incrementally, tightening control volumes and isolating clusters of enemy ships with methodical precision, turning a once unified armada into disconnected pockets of resistance that could be neutralized at leisure, and aboard Radiant Decree Vethric stood rigid as casualty projections surpassed thresholds that no concordance operation had ever approached, the numbers no longer abstract but tied to faces he recognized. Allies whose political support had made this mission possible now dying because of his certainty that humanity could be forced into compliance. And when his senior strategist proposed opening negotiations, immediately, Vethrix hesitated only long enough to realize the irony, that they now sought diplomacy not from strength but from desperation, yet he authorized the transmission anyway, ordering all weapons powered down in a visible gesture of surrender as a broad-spectrum signal was sent toward Earth requesting immediate cessation of hostilities, a request that lingered unanswered longer than comfort allowed, reinforcing the dread that humans were no longer reacting but choosing their timing, deliberately. And when a response finally arrived, it was not addressed to the Concordance Council or even to Vethrix by title, but simply acknowledged receipt of the surrender signal and stated that human forces were evaluating compliance across all sectors, advising Concordance vessels to maintain current positions and refrain from further maneuvering. A directive that left Vethrix acutely aware that his fleet now existed at human discretion, while across the system Human Command executed the next phase not as an act of vengeance but of demonstration, selectively disabling ships through targeted strikes that left hulls intact but power systems inert, allowing crews to survive and record their defeat. And as this unfolded, analysts within the Concordance began to grasp the wider implication that Earth's defenses were not improvised or reactionary but part of an integrated system spanning decades of quiet construction, layered not just around Earth but throughout the heliosphere, each component redundant and modular, designed to function even if large sections were destroyed, a resilience born not of arrogance but of a cultural memory that taught humans to plan for worst cases because history had shown them that safety was temporary, and that understanding cut deeply into Concordance ideology which prized visible dominance and rapid resolution, because it revealed a philosophical gap as dangerous as any technological one, and on Earth that philosophy manifested in scenes that would later circulate across the galaxy, footage of civilians watching the engagement not with triumphalism but solemn focus, emergency workers on standby, scientists monitoring gravitational feedback loops, school children sheltering underground while teachers explained calmly that the planet was defended and that what mattered now was endurance. Moments that contrasted starkly with the chaos aboard Concordance ships, where crews struggled to comprehend how a species portrayed as divided and inefficient had coordinated a defense of such staggering scale without public mobilization, and when Vethrix finally received a direct communication channel request from Admiral Carter, he accepted knowing there would be no bargaining leverage, the human admiral appearing on his display without ceremony, her expression composed as she informed him that hostilities would cease once all Concordance vessels had been rendered incapable of further aggression, and that no pursuit beyond the Sol system would occur, a statement that surprised him more than any threat could have, prompting him to ask why humanity would allow a defeated enemy to leave at all, to which Carter replied that Earth had no interest in conquest or extermination, only in ending the assumption that it could be coerced, and that the galaxy would carry the memory of this engagement without further encouragement. Words that landed with crushing weight because Vethrix understood their truth, that fear did not need to be enforced when it was witnessed, and as the final pockets of resistance fell silent and the once vast armada drifted powerless under human control, the realization spread through every surviving Concordance crew that the trap they had flown into had not been sprung in anger but in patience, the culmination of a species that had watched the stars for a long time and decided that if war ever came to their home, it would be fought on terms only they could dictate. In the aftermath of the silencing of Concordance weapons, the battle space settled into an unnatural stillness. Thousands of alien ships adrift in carefully maintained orbits, their power cores dampened by human field that allowed life support but nothing more. And for the first time since the Armada's arrival, the sky above Earth grew darker as emergency lighting from hostile hulls faded, revealing familiar constellations that grounded a shaken population in the sense that the planet had endured. While within Human Command structures there was no celebration, only controlled activity as medical teams prepared for prisoner intake, engineers monitored strain across gravity lattices, and diplomats assembled frameworks that had been drafted years earlier but never expected to be activated so publicly, because this phase had always been the most dangerous. Not the battle itself, but what followed when defeated powers sought to reshape the narrative, and Admiral Carter understood that the way humanity behaved now would define its place in the galaxy far more than the weapons it had revealed, a sentiment echoed by President Alvarez when he convened an emergency global address not to boast of victory but to explain the principles guiding human actions, emphasizing that Concordance crews would be treated humanely, that no retaliatory strikes would be launched beyond Sol, and that Earth sought a return to stable relations built on mutual respect rather than intimidation. Statements broadcast openly and without translation filters so that alien linguists could capture every nuance, and aboard the immobilized Radiant Decree, Vethrix listened to those words in silence, recognizing them as both reassurance and indictment, because they underscored how thoroughly the Concordance had misunderstood human priorities, assuming secrecy meant weakness and restraint meant indecision. And as liaison teams made first contact with stranded Concordance ships, the differences in approach became stark. Human envoys arriving without visible weapons, providing technical assistance to stabilize failing life support systems, and documenting every interaction with transparent protocols that left little room for accusation, gestures that confused many Concordance officers who had expected humiliation or punitive displays, yet those gestures were calculated as carefully as any battle maneuver, designed to ensure that when survivors returned home their testimony would be consistent and irrefutable, that humanity had not lashed out but had enforced a boundary, and within Concordance political apparatus that boundary began to reverberate even before the Armada's fate was formally resolved, as fragmented transmissions escaped Sol detailing losses and surrender, triggering emergency sessions on member worlds where leaders struggled to reconcile propaganda with reality, some calling for renewed resistance, others for immediate reconciliation, all under the shadow of the undeniable fact that Earth had withstood a unified assault and emerged in control, and as weeks passed, the practical challenges of managing thousands of disabled vessels forced unprecedented cooperation between former adversaries, human logistics coordinating supply convoys, medical evacuations, and controlled restoration of limited systems to allow orderly departures once agreements were reached. Processes that exposed Concordance crews to the depth of human organizational capacity, the mundane competence that underpinned the spectacular defenses, and Vethrix himself was granted a monitored visit to Earth as part of preliminary negotiations, descending through an atmosphere that remained intact and unscarred, witnessing cities functioning under elevated alert but not martial law, people going to work, children returning to schools, a society that had absorbed the shock and continued, an image that unsettled him more than any ruined landscape could have, because it suggested resilience woven into daily life rather than summoned only in crisis. And during a private exchange with Admiral Carter, he asked whether humanity had ever considered striking first to avoid such risk, a question she answered without hesitation by saying that humans understood too well the cost of preemptive war and had chosen instead to make aggression against them unprofitable beyond any possible gain, a philosophy that reframed the entire conflict not as a victory of force but a deterrence, matured through experience, and as formal accords were drafted to govern the Armada's withdrawal under human oversight, including restrictions on future Concordance deployments near Sol and mandatory disclosure of military movements within a defined radius, it became clear that the battle had achieved what years of diplomacy had not, forcing recognition of humanity as a strategic equal whose consent could no longer be bypassed. And while some Concordance hardliners muttered about temporary setbacks, the majority of survivors understood that the galaxy had crossed an irreversible threshold, that the era in which Earth could be surrounded without consequence had ended, replaced by a reality in which humanity's quiet preparation now sat as a constant variable in every calculation, shaping decisions far beyond the Sol system long after the last disabled warship began its escorted journey home. As the Concordance Armada departed Sol under escort, the galaxy began to absorb the shock in uneven waves, because information traveled faster than political consensus and the raw data of the engagement leaked despite every attempt to contain it. Sensor logs showing ships erased without debris, recordings of gravity fields twisting space, testimony from crews who had watched their weapons fail without understanding why. And on worlds far removed from human space analysts replayed those fragments, obsessively, searching for flaws, for exaggerations, for anything that could restore the comfortable hierarchy that had existed before Earth's defense shattered it. Yet no matter how the data was examined, conclusion remained the same. Humanity had not relied on a single superweapon or decisive trick, but on a layered system that combined physics, logistics, and long-term planning in a way that made direct confrontation with insult irrational, a fact that forced every major power to reassess its assumptions. While within the Concordance Council emergency sessions devolved into bitter recriminations, member species accusing one another of pushing escalation too far or ignoring warning signs. And although High Marshal Vethrix formally accepted responsibility for the operation, his confession did little to stem the political fallout as blocs fractured and long-standing alliances weakened under the strain of public outrage, because the image of invincibility had been more valuable than territory, and it had been lost in a single engagement. And as investigators combed through archives, they uncovered uncomfortable truths, reports from early human contact that had noted unusual patterns of infrastructure investment, cultural emphasis on redundancy, and a tendency to plan across generations rather than election cycles. Warnings that had been dismissed as irrelevant curiosities because humans lacked visible empire or expansionist doctrine, and those ignored observations now resurfaced as evidence that the Concordance had failed not through lack of strength, but through lack of patience, a contrast highlighted by humanity's response after the battle, as Earth did not capitalize on its advantage by demanding tribute or imposing regimes, but instead reopened diplomatic channels with revised terms that emphasized transparency and mutual non-aggression, offering technological cooperation in civilian fields and shared oversight mechanisms for conflict prevention. Proposals that some alien leaders initially suspected as traps until independent observers confirmed that humans were following through exactly as stated, releasing captured data, allowing neutral inspections of non-classified installations, and dismantling portions of their own active defenses once restrictions were codified, actions that reframed the narrative from conquest to coexistence on new footing. And on Earth, the public discourse evolved from relief to introspection, debates filling media channels about the cost of secrecy, the ethics of hidden militarization, and the responsibility that came with revealing such power. Conversations guided by the understanding that while humanity had won the engagement, it had also announced itself irrevocably to the galaxy, eliminating any future option of anonymity or underestimated growth. A reality President Alvarez addressed directly in a speech acknowledging that the age of quiet preparation was over, and that humanity would now have to lead as visibly as it defended, words that resonated beyond Earth as they were translated and disseminated widely, influencing emerging species that saw in humanity not a conqueror but a cautionary example. And as months passed, the long-term effect became clearer. Trade routes realigned to avoid even the perception of threatening Sol, border disputes paused as powers recalculated escalation thresholds, and smaller civilizations sought human mediation in conflict where Concordance authority had once been unquestioned. Shifts that did not go unnoticed by human strategists who understood that influence often followed restraint more effectively than force, and in a final private exchange before Vethrix was recalled to face judgment on his homeworld, he was asked by a Concordance historian what single factor he believed had doomed the operation, to which he replied not technology or numbers, but the assumption that humanity thought in the same time frames as the rest of the galaxy, an admission that would later be cited as the most concise summary of the Sol engagement, because it captured the essence of what the Armada had failed to see, that humans had never been waiting for war, they had been waiting for certainty. And once that certainty arrived, they acted with a resolve shaped not by rage or ambition, but by a long memory of vulnerability that had taught them to build defenses strong enough that they would only ever need to be used once. In the year that followed the Sol engagement, the galaxy entered a period historians would later call the recalibration, a time marked less by open conflict than by pervasive hesitation, as powers accustomed to decisive displays of strength found themselves constrained by the knowledge that at least one species had demonstrated the ability to end a war without leaving its home system. And for humanity, that recalibration brought challenges as complex as any battle, because deterrence once revealed had to be managed carefully or it risked becoming provocation, a reality that occupied human leadership as much as any remaining defense posture, and Admiral Carter, now tasked with overseeing the transition from emergency command to long-term strategic policy, spent more time in diplomatic chambers and control rooms, fielding requests from alien delegations that ranged from genuine outreach to thinly veiled intelligence gathering, each probing for limits, for confirmation that Sol had been an exception rather than a template, And while humans declined to discuss classified systems, they made no attempt to downplay the principles behind them, openly acknowledging that the defenses were the product of centuries of incremental development driven by a cultural aversion to existential risk. An honesty that unsettled many listeners because it suggested there were no hidden ideological triggers or expansionist agendas to exploit, only a firm boundary that would not be crossed again. And as new accords were ratified establishing buffer zones and inspection regimes, the practical effects of that boundary became evident. Piracy declined sharply near human space as criminal networks realized that any incursion risked unpredictable consequences. Proxy wars stalled when sponsors hesitated to escalate in a climate where intervention might invite human scrutiny. And even within the fractured concordance, remnants of the old order began to reform around the recognition that centralized coercion was no longer viable, giving rise to regional councils that prioritized conflict prevention over dominance, shift that some hailed as progress and others decried as weakness, but which all acknowledged were influenced by the precedents set at Earth. While within human society the long-concealed infrastructure gradually emerged into public awareness not through sudden revelations but through structured disclosure. Museums opening exhibits explaining early system defenses, educational programs contextualizing the philosophy of layered deterrence, and oversight bodies empowered to audit military projects with civilian representation, steps taken to ensure that the power revealed in crisis did not drift beyond democratic control, and these internal measures became as closely watched by alien observers as any fleet movement, because they offered insight into how humanity governed itself under the weight of newfound influence, and in many respects those observers were surprised to see contention rather than unity, vigorous debates over budgets, ethics, and the role of secrecy playing out openly, reinforcing the idea that humanity's strength had not come from monolithic control, but from systems resilient enough to function amid disagreement, an aspect that resonated with smaller species who saw in that model a potential alternative to hierarchical empires. And as requests for human mediation increased, Earth found itself reluctantly stepping into a role it had never sought, hosting talks between rivals who trusted human neutrality precisely because humans had demonstrated they did not need to extract concessions through force, a trust tested when an isolated border clash erupted between two former concordance members, and both sides appealed to Earth to arbitrate, a situation that prompted intense internal deliberation before a human delegation agreed to intervene under strict conditions, deploying observers and technical monitors rather than warships. And when the ceasefire held a significance was not lost on the wider galaxy, because it marked the first time peace had been enforced not by threat of annihilation but by the credibility of restraint backed by capability, a subtle but profound shift in galactic norms. And throughout this period, High Marshal Vethrix awaited judgment on his homeworld, his trial becoming a focal point for broader debates about accountability and doctrine. And when he was finally called to testify, he did not attempt to justify the invasion as a necessary gamble, but framed it as a logical outcome of a system that rewarded decisive aggression over long-term understanding, a system that had misread humanity because it valued visible power over latent preparedness, testimony that circulated widely and influenced reforms far beyond his own fate. And as the anniversary of the Sol engagement approached, human leadership faced a final unresolved question, whether to mark the date publicly or let it pass without ceremony. A decision that encapsulated the tension between remembrance and escalation, and in the end they chose a middle path, holding a global observance focused not on victory but on survival, honoring those lost on all sides and reaffirming commitments to prevent such confrontations from recurring, an event broadcast galaxy-wide that underscored the message humanity had been conveying since the battle, that its greatest weapon was not any single technology, but the decision to treat war as a failure of imagination rather than an inevitability, a stance that continued to challenge and reshape galactic expectations as species adjusted to a future in which Earth was no longer an unknown variable but a constant consideration in every plan, not as a looming conqueror but as a reminder that patience, once combined with resolve, could alter the balance of power without ever leaving home. The final confirmation that the galaxy had changed came not through treaties or trials, but through absence, the quiet absence of armadas massing near borders, of ultimatums delivered with confidence, of younger worlds being coerced into alliances they did not understand. And in that silence, humanity found itself adjusting to a role it had never openly claimed but could no longer deny. Because Sol had become a reference point in every strategic model, a place planners mentioned cautiously as an example of what happened when assumptions went unexamined, and for Earth that status brought neither celebration nor comfort, only responsibility. As Admiral Carter retired from active command, knowing her greatest task had not been winning a battle but ensuring it never needed to be fought again. And President Alvarez concluded his final term by overseeing the integration of Earth's defense philosophy into international and interstellar law, codifying principles that emphasize consent, transparency, and proportionality, measures designed to prevent the quiet preparations that had saved humanity from becoming tools of fear themselves. And years later, when the Sol engagement was taught in academies across dozens of worlds, it was rarely framed as a human victory over concordance, but as a systemic failure of escalation, a case study in how power wielded without understanding invited disaster. A narrative reinforced by the fate of High Marshal Vethrix, whose sentence, though severe, was accompanied by formal acknowledgement from his own people that responsibility lay as much with the doctrine he served as with the decisions he made, and on Earth the physical traces of the battle faded completely, orbital lanes cleared, defense platforms returned to dormant states or dismantled under oversight, the sky returning to its familiar patterns, yet the memory endured in quieter ways, in the way humanity approached first contact with new species by leading with patience, rather than bravado, in the way engineers continue to design systems with redundancies that assume failure rather than perfection, and in the cultural understanding that survival was not guaranteed by strength alone, but by the wisdom to decide when that strength must be revealed. And when a generation that had been children during the Armada's arrival grew into leadership roles, they carried with them not the trauma of invasion, but the lesson of restraint, having learned that the trap at Earth had not been a moment of triumph, but of clarification. The instant the galaxy realized humanity's place was neither beneath nor above others, but firmly its own, a species that would not seek dominion yet would never again be mistaken for prey. And as exploration resumed under new accords and human vessels once more ventured beyond Sol, they did so without hidden defenses or silent warnings, traveling openly into a galaxy that now understood the unspoken rule written in the aftermath of the Armada's defeat, that Earth had not closed itself to the stars, but had made clear that anyone who came in force would lead with knowledge rather than conquest, and that in itself was enough, because the realization had already done what the battle was meant to prevent, ensuring that no power would ever again believe surrounding Earth was a show of strength, when history had proven it to be an invitation into a trap laid not in anger but in patience, and closed only once, for all to see.